So I wanted to welcome everyone to RTI International to our event on SEL From Policy to Practice, co-hosted with NISSEM. And I'm just going to be very brief and do a few housekeeping things and then turn it over to Dr. Colette Chabot, who will be providing a formal welcome. We have at least 45 representatives from different organizations here today, working at all different levels of education, including ECD, primary, secondary, out-of-school youth, and workforce development. Across all of us, we work in pedagogy, on teaching and learning materials, measurement, research, and policy. But we're all here today because we are interested in one thing. We are interested in moving beyond just raising awareness on social and emotional learning and actually doing something about it and talking about how to turn the different policy on SEL that has come out this past year into practice. And so we have two panels for you, one on the recent donor policies on SEL from this year, and a second panel of our partners who are working to implement SEL programs in low resource and crisis and conflict settings. So I will let Dr. Chabot speak more about that, but I first just wanted to say a few housekeeping items because everyone will ask. So the first and most important is, yes, coffee will be here later. And I think we have quite a few caffeine addicts in the room. Coffee will arrive between the two panels and we'll have a formal break for that. So don't worry, we'll all get our caffeine fix. There is Wi-Fi here if you want to log on. The restrooms are, if you're facing the registration table, down that hallway that's on your right and on the right. There's a code for the women and the men's. Don't confuse them. And for our schedule and lineup today, we will have the first panel, as I said, with our donors. So we have Dr. Victoria Levin from the World Bank, Ramya from GPE, and Anjuli Shivshanker from USAID. And then we'll have a short Q&A for the donor panel that will be about 15 minutes. We do have, we are logged into Zoom, so we do have virtual attendees as well who will also be able to ask questions through a moderated Zoom session. We'll then break for coffee, and then we'll have our second panel of speakers. We have Michael Childress from FHI 360, Dr. Nikit Desai from the University of Notre Dame, Julia Fender-Jana from Save the Children, Dr. Matthew Jukes from RTI, and Dr. Elizabeth Randolph is actually quite sick today, and she lives in South Africa, so she couldn't get on a plane. So I am going to do my best to do her presentation for her. And then we will have about 45 minutes, if we want to stay that long, for a combined Q&A at the end. So just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to be here today, and I will turn it over to Dr. Chabot.
Thank you, Julianne. Good afternoon. My name is Colette Chabot, and with my colleague, Professor James Williams, sitting right over here, yes, on his phone. We are both co-conveners of NISSEM. We are both at the International Education Program at George Washington University, and we've been supported in this not only by RTI, who's been a wonderful sponsor for this workshop, and we want to thank them so much, and all the staff that's been working with Julianne to make this move so smoothly. But also we have several GWU interns that have been helping out, including Kazumi Homa. Would you like to stand, Kazumi? And you've been checked in outside by Mengzhou. And we have wonderful interns at GW. So if any of you need any, just speak to myself or to Jim. We'd be happy to comply. We have, NISSEM was founded in 2018 as a network of academics and educators and workers and humanitarian and development organizations to promote the integration of SDG Target 4.7 themes and SEL into educational materials. We've sponsored several international workshops. We have produced a report for UNESCO on global citizenship education and education for sustainable development in the curriculum of 10 countries. We have most recently, however, published a major online edited volume called the NISSEM Global Briefs. And there'll be a little thing at the bottom, a link to that on some of the future slides. We should be over on the agenda, shouldn't we? There we go. And so I would, that gave, in September, we had a major launch of that publication. And that gave us a chance to meet with several donors like GPE and with the World Bank. And what we learned from them and their progress on their policies is something we wanted to share with all of you. We also wanted to have a chance to feature a few more of our authors from the Global Briefs and some other people who were not able to contribute to this round, but we may be doing some more briefs in the future. We have this great lineup of eight panelists today, so I don't want to take too long on this introduction, but my job before I begin moderating is to put these in context because they cover quite a range. And to do that, I'm going to explain just a little more about NISSEM. First of all, I confess this is not the name that we wish that we had. This is a very long name, Networking to Integrate SEG Target 4.7 and SEL in Educational Materials. And that only covers 3 of the 4 things we're really interested in. We're still working on getting the 4th one in there somehow. But we are interested in these things, and today specifically we're going to focus on SEL because all of these are what we consider synergistic. Since the SDGs came out, Target 4.7 themes actually contain a lot of the work that we'd like to see done in education around SEL. They cover conflict resolution, they cover human rights, they cover gender equity, they cover many of the things for which we need more social and emotional engagement. So social and emotional learning, and we'll take each of these somewhat separately, promotes lifelong engagement in learning, and it has engagement is key to the SDG commitment and follow through. If we don't have social and emotional engagement, children are going to learn about some of these topics and they're not going to follow through on them by the time they get, and we need this to go beyond basic education and into secondary and further into workforce development as well. It contributes to social cohesion and inclusion. It improves academic achievement, at least from the high income country standpoints, but it is missing in many teaching and learning and materials. And these teaching and learning materials are important because often in low and middle income countries and in conflict settings and post-conflict settings, the only resources available in the classroom are educational materials. So as much as we might want to do teacher training and we might want to do work with teachers, which is how we do SEL in high income countries, in many of these settings, the only thing they have to work with really is educational materials. And we are finding that they are utterly missing in social and emotional learning, not to mention many of the themes in Target SDG 4.7. So we're very concerned about the status of these educational materials, but many countries have signed on to SDG Target 4.7. They've said, yes, we want to start putting these things into our work, and so they're ready to do these revisions, but they need help doing that because simply saying we're going to put SEL into the curriculum doesn't necessarily get it in a way that's going to be effective and that is going to last for a lifelong commitment. Almost all the organizations that we found in international development and humanitarian work, almost all of them are interested in at least 3 of these things. And moreover, what we've discovered is in many cases we need to be looking at middle income countries because they are the ones that are beginning to produce some materials that then might be useful in some other settings. And we're going to see a great example of that today because the World Bank has been working on something in Peru called Step by Step, and that is now being translated into work in Syria and other countries by Save the Children. So we'll hear about that. Much of this work with educational materials isn't going to be automatic. It involves training that doesn't yet exist. Several of our co-conveners have been experimenting with how you begin to train textbook developers, how you train educational materials, how you help with supplemental reading materials for writers of those, but we need to develop standards. We need to develop some help for that. So all of this is in progress, but is very timely, we think. It is, however, despite the number of things covered in those 4 things, it is still what we call a selective approach. In other words, we're not promising to do everything. We are not promising that this will cover all aspects of education and that it will be a complete and holistic, but we're getting closer. For the last 10, 15 years, we've been focusing in many organizations on basic education and early grade reading. And that's beginning to take hold. We've got ways of measuring it. Math has been added on top, but we all know that's not a complete quality education. We want to put social and emotional learning in there, and we think that there are ways to begin doing it now. And we think that this will then begin to, as Matthew will talk about, what we're concerned about is one of the things is this could actually start improving some of those outcomes that we're not so happy about with some of those big investments in early grade reading, not seeing the bump in learning that we'd really like to see. The selective approach is worthwhile. This was done in health, it was done in agriculture, where they focused on specific crops, they focused on specific interventions, because when it succeeds, it then inspires more action, more funding, and more for related activities. So it isn't that we're never going to talk about any of those other aspects of education. It's just that these at the moment are something that we seem to have some real energy around. The need for this in low and middle income countries and this emphasis on materials for us is very apparent in many places. This is not a conflict setting. This is a school that is meeting under a metro bridge in Delhi. These are not professional teachers. They do not have room to have lots of teachers' guides. These kids do not have lots of supplemental reading materials or supplemental materials. They don't have lots of stuff. What they all do have is a textbook. And the teacher, however, if all that is in this textbook is highly dense material, may have a very hard time covering it. So what we're supporting with educational materials is building both strong content and strong pedagogy into educational materials. So we're not just worrying about what the content is and getting SEL in general, but also building pedagogy that's supportive of doing SEL into those educational materials, assuming that these teachers may not get those teachers' guides, that they may not get those extra materials, that they may not get a whole lot of training, but they will teach what they find in the textbook. One of the things we find is that people talk a lot about teacher-centered education and child-centered education, but in fact, what we see in a lot of places is actually textbook-centered education, where the textbook becomes a curriculum, the textbook is what happens, and the educational material and the supplemental materials are places we can begin to introduce some things, but the teachers may not always be using those. So we care very much about these. So this is a good example in Bangladesh. This is a very classic primary social studies textbook using the traditional approach. It's very dense on text. It's very high level. This is complex text that most of the children at this level probably can't read very well. There's a bunch of comprehension questions at the end. They're given about 3 hours to cover this unit on tolerance of others' opinions. So another way of approaching this is to put it in a format that has exercises built into it that are appropriate to large classes, and that the teacher has got a way of a little assessment at the end to see whether the children are getting this, and break this into 2 90-minute components that teachers perhaps can use a little more easily. We did the global briefs because when we started working on SEL about 3 years ago, it seemed that everybody was using CASEL, everybody was referring to high-income countries, but we knew of good work that was going on elsewhere. We knew people were investing in this. Now, not a lot of it was on directly educational materials, but we know to get to educational materials, we have to start with some commitments, and that SDG 4.7 and SDG 4 gives us some international commitments that may lead into national education laws and policies, that may lead to core curricula and syllabi getting changed, that may hopefully lead to some real time spent developing local contextual SEL and other themes, and that will lead then to new textbooks, materials, and assessments, because without assessments, Whatever we teach is not going to be, the teachers are not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. And finally, the monitoring the cognitive, behavioral, and social and emotional outcomes. So we know we need all of this. So we said, fine. And we ended up with 48 briefs. There are more people here. Catherine Blanchard from the Smithsonian Institution, and there are several others here as well who have also contributed briefs. Ji Sun Jeong from GW. But we are featuring just a few people here, particularly the folks from RTI that have been so helpful. Our other thing about these briefs is in all of them, you're going to see that we are at this stage, we're looking for several things. We're looking for innovations. We're looking for pilots. We're looking for evidence and standards and policies. And we're looking for them actually in whatever order we can get them at this point. At the beginning, you take what you can get. We hope eventually there'll be champions to move these forward on the national level. But we want to emphasize that pilots that do not generate usable evidence are not necessarily useful. I spent years working with child-friendly schools with lots of people being very, very enthused, and we had no evidence, and we never did get any evidence. We have standards that need to be developed, but those standards have got to be done by the people that are going to use them. They have to be a group effort. They can't just be issued. And innovations that are detached from policies and evidence can just waste resources. So with that, I want to introduce our first panel that's going to talk a bit about policies and a bit about also some things that they're beginning to try and to support. So I would like to first begin, if I could get my panelists to stand. First of all, I'm going to bring them up here one by one but if you could stand and face the audience anyway. There we go. That's what they look like. Okay. So we have Victoria Levin, who's the senior economist in the Education Global Practice. And she is also the lead on Skills and Global Solutions Group. Her group focuses on skills, on secondary and youth and workforce development issues, not on a lot of the primary stuff that many of us have been more familiar with. Anjuli Shivshankar, yes, is from USAID. I think many of you know her, and she's going to be presenting the USAID new policy on social and emotional learning. And Ramya Vivekanandan from GPE has been doing a tremendous amount of work. She almost published with us, but then GPE changed its mind. But we wanted to give her a chance to present here and to tell us their update on where they are with their materials. So let us not waste any more time. Let's start with Victoria, then we'll go to Anjuli, and then we'll go to Ramya. So if the two of you could sit and I could have Victoria over here.
And just a quick announcement, I want to tell everyone that this music will be done in 7 minutes. So I have a timer.
And the idea of having Julianne and I do an introduction was so we would be the ones that would be yelling over the music. Yes.
This was the reason for the time change of the event, so thanks for your...
Thank you so much. I actually enjoy this peppy music. So I was told that I should stand over here so the camera actually sees me.
Oh, dear.
Yes.
If you want to tell me when to switch slides.
Oh, I can
You can do this.
Yeah. So sometimes I will peek over what is it that you're seeing. Okay, so now you're seeing my presentation. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present to you some of the work that we're doing at the World Bank on this agenda. So the 15 minutes of my time, what I'll do is I'll show you a little bit about why we're engaging on this topic, what is the motivation for us, the World Bank. Usually people don't think of the World Bank engaging on something called socio-emotional skills, since people usually think of us as a bunch of economists. And then I will give you two directions in which we're moving. So one is on measurement, and the other one is on developing socio-emotional skills. So this is probably very familiar to most of you, but what we've been seeing from the economics point of view is that there is an ongoing de-routinization of work going on around the world. So what does that mean? That means that the routine tasks are decreasing in terms of labor demand. And the non-routine tasks, which are tasks that involve higher order cognitive skills or they involve social-emotional skills, are increasing in demand. So this is a famous study by Otter based on the methodology by Otter et al. And one important point from this graph is that this trend is happening not only in OECD countries, but it's also happening in our client countries. And our client countries are realizing that. They're realizing that these skills, these socio-emotional, or some people call them soft or non-cognitive skills, they're important. They're increasingly important for the labor force, and they're increasingly important for all kinds of life outcomes. So James Heckman was the economist who made this point again and again, and he's still making it. He has a new paper in the most recent ISA working papers, again going over for why we're engaged in this agenda. And so our client countries are asking us increasingly to help them, both in terms of diagnosing whether their populations are prepared for this increase in demand on these skills, and whether there's anything that can be done to train the workforce or the flow of the workforce, so the students who will be workers, in how to become better in those skills. So when we think about skills at the World Bank, usually we have this framework in mind. We divide skills into three very broad buckets. The first bucket is cognitive skills, which includes both foundational skills such as literacy and numeracy, as well as higher order cognitive skills, such as problem solving and critical thinking. The second bucket is technical skills. So these skills are usually occupation specific, you might think. And they're usually developed either through post-secondary education or on-the-job training. And then the third bucket is what we're talking about today, which are skills called socio-emotional skills. We prefer the term socio-emotional, although we recognize that there's different terms floating around. So these skills are beliefs, personality traits, behaviors, attitudes that basically help a person to deal with society and help a person, an individual, to perform different tasks. So recently we've also been talking about digital skills. So we think of digital skills as something that is cross-cutting because it draws on a lot of cognitive skills, technical skills, and maybe surprisingly, social-emotional skills as well. If you think of identifying fake news from real news, that could involve critical thinking, problem solving. If you think of an IT support person trying to empathize with their client in order to understand what is the problem that they're experiencing, and so on. So let's talk about the measurement side. So on the measurement side, we have had the program that's called the STEP Skills Measurement Surveys, which have been implemented in 15 countries around the world, as you can see. And so the unique feature of these surveys, which target the working age population in all these developing countries, is that they have a distinct skills module, which has different measures of skills. So for cognitive skills, it has both direct measure of literacy, as well as self-report in terms of the use of those skills at work and in daily life. For technical skills, it just relies on self-reports in terms of use of computer, use of email, again, in work and in daily life. And then again, what we're talking about today is the social-emotional skills. Here we have a module that measures, based on self-reports, the big 5 personality traits and a few other social-emotional skills constructs, such as grit, decision-making, hostile attribution bias, and in wave 3, growth mindset. So these surveys have been implemented already in 15 countries. And as you can see, we've sort of sampled a few countries in each region. So based on these surveys, numerous reports have been written, and they're out there, you can read them. The reports correlate performance on these skills modules with the outcomes that we, as mostly economists, care about. So this particular slide talks about labor market outcomes. So for socio-emotional skills, what these reports show is that in most countries, employability could be correlated with socio-emotional skills. In some countries, the choice of the type of occupation or the type of job is correlated with socio-emotional skills. And in some countries, wages and earnings are correlated with socio-emotional skills, which tells us that there is a significant return to socio-emotional skills in many developing countries. But there is a challenge. So the types of questions that have been developed and used in the STEP skills measurement surveys have been designed and mostly validated in developed country context. So US and EU. So we took them with the STEP skills measurement survey, we took them outside of those contexts. And what this paper, which recently came out in Science, shows is that sometimes when you take these kinds of instruments out of their context, they lose validity. So why does that happen? Well, this paper talks about 3 reasons. One, seems to be an acquiescence bias. So basically, at some point, the respondents just says yes or no to everything. The second one is that sometimes the numerators apparently influence the responses of the respondents on those measures. And the third is that just the level of education and the level of literacy of the respondent is sometimes insufficient to understand the types of questions that are included on those instruments. So this is very challenging, and this is not very encouraging, but we're trying to move forward by basically reconceptualizing the socio-emotional skills measurement agenda a little bit. So we're thinking, and this work is just in its beginnings, but what we're thinking about is trying to focus more on the person's capacity as opposed to their personality traits. So this might seem like a small shift, but if you focus on capacity, that means that these are skills that can be learned. So this might seem like a marginal change, but if you ask a person, are you shy around people? This is something that is inherent to them. This is relatively stable across circumstances, and it would be hard to change. So this is a personality trait. But if you ask a person, can you start a conversation with a stranger, or how well do you think you can do in starting a conversation with a stranger? This is more of a capacity question, and this is more of a skill that can be learned, even though that you might be a shy person who does not like to do this, but you can perform in this type of a situation and in this type of task. So the second direction in which we're moving is that we're starting to think of how to culturally adapt questions from the outset. Instead of taking something that was designed and validated in the US or European context, how to choose items that are more likely to work in many contexts, and how to pre-test them in those contexts before fielding it. And the third direction is basically moving somewhat away from self-reports by triangulating self-reports with other assessment methods, either teacher reports for students, direct observer reports, or even asking students or our target population to do some authentic performance tasks. So, of course, we know that there's this great paper by Angela Duckworth and Yeager that says that with both performance tasks and self-reports, there are different challenges. So it's hard to just move away from one to the other and solve the problem. But again, we're trying to move on this initiative and see, hopefully we'll get new results and then we can present them in the next event. So what about developing socio-emotional skills? So we have been doing for many years different interventions that pertain to socio-emotional skills. Sometimes it's hard to actually define what is a socio-emotional skills intervention because the boundaries between soft skills training, life skills training, or just something that's employability training are very permeable. But it's also difficult to categorize these types of intervention. This is one of our attempts to do it. So we break it down into school-wide approaches, standalone interventions, and post-school programs. Now, the examples you see there are not just World Bank examples, as you can probably guess. We did not do the KIPP schools in the US, but this is basically just to make you think of which kinds of interventions we think would go into which buckets. So school-wide approaches are more comprehensive interventions that are at least at the level of the whole school. Standalone interventions are much more narrow, so they would deal with only one construct, for example, or just one age grade level. And post-school interventions are different just because usually the population is much harder to capture. And you need to really make it appropriate for that target group. So I'll give you 3 examples that are in orange of some of the interventions we have been working on. There are a lot more out there, but I think I have 5 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, so I'll do that very quickly. And I can talk about them a lot more during question and answer. So the first one is the one that Colette already mentioned. This is PASO a PASO that was designed by the Ministry of Education in Peru in collaboration with the World Bank. And this is a very comprehensive socio-emotional skills program. So it encompasses many grades and many skills. And the great thing about it is that it builds a progression from grade 1 to grade 10 or 11. So it would, for example, this takes into account the fact that you need to learn some skills before you can learn other skills. And this builds this progression into the program, into the curriculum. It also shows you that for each grade, it is working on these different skills, sort of in parallel, but it has these objectives for a specific grade level on all of the skills. And in a pilot of 300 plus schools, this brought significant results in terms of their tests. The second is a standalone intervention. So probably all of you know about growth mindset and growth mindset interventions and how they're very low intensity and low cost. So the MBED group at the World Bank, which deals with behavioral interventions, was very inspired by this research by Carol Dweck. So they did a very low intensity intervention in Peru, where they just basically dropped off a poster, a lesson plan, and then showed up a few months later to check on what happened. So this very low intensity intervention increased reading scores of 8th graders in 2 out of 3 regions of Peru. But more interestingly, it increased 7th graders scores 14 months after this very low intensity intervention, even more than the 8th graders scores. So what that tells us is that it basically changed something in the mindset of the 7th graders that then accumulated these gains over time. And then finally, this is a very complex, award-winning virtual online intervention that was implemented in Africa, in Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, and soon will be implemented in South Africa as well. This is called Evoke, and it's a multiplayer online educational experience that builds social innovator skills. And those skills are in 4 clusters. And basically, it has been shown to actually build those skills in its participants. So our current priorities in terms of this agenda on developing socio-emotional skills are to build a community inside the World Bank, because there are many of us doing different things, and we want to make sure that all those people have an anchor. So we already have over 100 staff members, and Colette had a chance to see some of them during a recent lunch seminar. We're currently undertaking, or starting to undertake, a stock taking of all of these initiatives, some of which I showed you today, just to be able to understand what is it that we have done and what is it that we can what we can learn from these interventions in order to feed into our future work on this agenda. With that, I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much.
Nice catch.
Don't want the mic people to be angry at us. Do you have the, Victoria, do you have the clicker? Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Anjuli Shivshanker, and I work at USAID. I'm the co-chair of the Social and Emotional Learning Working Group, and my other co-chairs, Graciela Braceno and Kayleen Resler, are also here joining me, along with a lot of other USAID colleagues. So thanks you guys for joining today. And I'm the Senior Research Advisor for the Education and Conflict and Crisis team. And so what I want to kind of start off by emphasizing is that USAID doesn't have a separate social and emotional learning or social and emotional skills policy. This is part and parcel of USAID's Office of Education policy. And that means that we see social and emotional skills or soft skills as relevant from pre-primary all the way through higher education, including youth workforce development. And education isn't going to be the only place at USAID that you'll see or hear the words social and emotional skills, soft skills. In global health, they might call them life skills. If you work with our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, they might be talking about psychosocial support or psychosocial services or outcomes. If you're working with Center for Resilience colleagues, you'll hear about the concept of psychosocial resilience. So it's not just the Office of Education, but we are, for the first time, integrating this into our work. So I want to talk a little bit about how we came to this point. Traditionally, under our previous strategy, the Office of Education prioritized a fairly limited number of outcomes: reading, access, and some youth workforce outcomes. But under our new policy, we do in fact identify social and emotional skills and soft skills as particular outcomes important in their own right. So how did we get here? We actually met a couple of weeks ago to reflect on how this policy change came to be. So I want to take you through some elements that we found in common over the past maybe 4 or 5 years of this kind of policy development and progress. So the first thing that we identified is that opening ourselves up to being influenced by our partners was an incredibly important and influential reason why social and emotional skills are inside our policy. And 2 particular networks that I wanted to call out are the Education and Conflict and Crisis Network, which had a task team of implementing partners whose goal was to influence us at USAID. And the second is the Interagency Network on Education and Emergencies, which has both the PSS-SEL Collaborative and also an Education Policy and Standards Working Group. And in both of those, we've covered kind of psychosocial support, the intersection with social and emotional learning for many years at this point. The second was hearing demand and interest from other stakeholders, whether that's academics, whether that's other donors, whether that's the field at large, whether that's from host country governments, but hearing that other people are also wanting to have these skills and outcomes included in their work was extremely important for us to hear about. Not least of which is because it influenced what our missions actually put out on the street as bids that we were looking for implementing partners to help us work with in order to do. And so then finally, this kind of culminated in what was called an SEL roundtable in June of 2018, so a little over a year ago. And that really gave us the opportunity to use our role as the Office of Education to convene stakeholders and elevate the technical issue up to the highest levels of our bureau. And then essentially that is really what we think catalyzed the inclusion of these skills as standalone outcomes in our policy. And the reason why this is such an important turning point in the policy at USAID is because now this means that education investments can be used to program towards these skills. Of course, this will always be in collaboration with other important outcomes that are important for ministries of education, that are important for ministries of youth, ministries of health, but they are something that we can put our time and effort towards. And this is not just for programming that is run by an education officer at USAID, but it's all education programming, again, from pre-primary to higher ed. So if you are working with colleagues in conflict mitigation and management and they're running education programming, if you're working with Food for Peace and they're running education programming, this policy is applicable across the board. So this was a pretty influential moment for us and really laid the foundation for our technical work. So what we did in August of this year was issue a supplemental brief to the education policy, which goes over what it means at USAID to include social and emotional skills in our programming. And so the 3 things that this policy brief tries to do are provide first an introductory understanding of what we mean at USAID by social and emotional skills, soft skills. Spoiler alert, we do not define them very precisely. We recognize that there's a lot of different terms out there. And what we really wanted to emphasize to our missions is that instead of obsessing over the specific word choice, make sure that you're in agreement on what is the skill you're trying to build, whatever you call it, and how does that fit within your theory of change, and what are the outcomes that you're driving at. The second thing that we try and do is talk very generally about quality standards. What does it mean to integrate this work in a way that adheres to what we think our best practice is, fully recognizing that this is a field that is in some ways nascent, especially in fragile states, especially in the settings where we work, maybe not so much in high-income countries, but there's not going to be a single answer anywhere. There is no universal solution to some of these problems. And then the third, we wanted to lay out where we feel as an Office of Education, we have shared research and learning interests. And I'll take you guys through a couple of those right now. So first, as you can imagine, we're super interested in finding out when interventions work, where, for whom, but very importantly, why and at what cost. We're also interested in getting better at measurement. I think a lot of our panelists, both this afternoon, and I think my GPE colleague will talk a little bit about this, but being able to measure, quantify qualitatively and quantitatively these outcomes and how they progress across ages and stages is super interesting for us at USAID. Third is the role of gender, power, culture, privilege in the development of these skills. One of our policy priorities is equity and inclusion, and we cannot possibly begin to live that policy principle without understanding how all of these other factors are intersecting at individuals, at schools, in communities, and in the education system. The fourth one is the role of an inclusive learning environment, and so this means not only from the perspective of disability inclusion, but inclusion writ large, as well as gender. The role of technology is of interest to us. How do you really leverage technology, either to build these skills or to create an inclusive learning environment, or to address the barriers that are thrown up by power, culture, gender, and privilege? And then the last three are really thinking about our commitment to the journey to self-reliance and education system strengthening. So thinking about if an intervention is effective, how do we bring that to scale inside an education system? What does that mean when, practically speaking, a lot of interventions are found to be effective at a very localized way, especially in countries that have incredible cultural diversity, and particularly in conflict and crisis affected places where understanding the relationship between conflict dynamics, ethnic identity, other types of identity, and the school system. And then finally, in thinking about our work with higher education. So in a lot of ways, we believe that higher education institutions are probably one of the most valuable partners that we can have in research and learning. They are the places where we will find those with the most contextual expertise, the most experience, a vested interest, and an appropriate mandate to drive forward this learning. And then lastly, thinking about what's the role of higher education institutions in preparing the workforce that we need, whether that's in youth workforce, whether that's in the teaching workforce, whether that's in the policy workforce. Whether that's in the ag workforce, whether that's in the governance workforce.
Anjuli,
Yes.
could I get you to get really friendly with that mic?
Oh, yes. Is this better? Okay. So what I wanted to kind of close with is talking about the SEL working group at USAID. So this is an internal working group. And like I said, a big part of how SEL came to be included in our policy at USAID was really dependent on external communities of practice. Of course, the Education and Conflict and Crisis Network is one that was a contract primed by EDC, which will end, unfortunately, in December. But INEE, of course, continues to endure as they are outside completely of USAID. But the SEL working group is an internal group that is really convened to help institutionalize best practices throughout our missions, kind of similar to the community of practice that Victoria talked about. And so our group has three goals. So first, we want to support our missions to do this work well. Second, we want to make sure that our partners know what we're thinking and still continue to allow ourselves to be influenced by you. And three, we want to provide thought leadership, particularly in elevating the best available evidence we have and getting that put into decision making. So to that end, we have a couple of different priorities for this year. So the first I'll talk about is technical guidance. So a large part of our education investments are made in primary education systems, and actually 50% of those are made in places affected by conflict and crisis. And what we envision is that many missions will look to build on those investments, but integrate social and emotional skills or outcomes somewhere into that programming, if that's the direction they're going to go in. So actually next week, we are going to have kind of the first of what is a pretty new process for us. We're going to try out a workshop format where we invite both internal and external stakeholders to come and try and pull together what we think might be the bare basic best principles to actually integrate this work well. So instead of seeing a results framework from USAID, where every time we say literacy, we also say social and emotional skills, and we also say numeracy, we're hoping that that's a little bit more reflective of all of the work that has actually already been done over the past 10 or 15 years in the places that we're working in. The second is measurement guidance. So actually both in basic education and in higher education and youth workforce, there's work going on to support global aggregation. So if any of you guys have ever had to report against an F indicator, those are still there. And we're going to include soft skills and social and emotional skills in those F indicators. And we're also hoping to be able to leverage what our partners are doing in the field to provide improved measurement guidance for monitoring, evaluation, assessment, needs assessment at the activity level. The second is evidence products, and this I would love for you to catch me at the coffee break or afterwards to give feedback on some of these priorities, because the first is a systematic review. So I started working on social and emotional learning maybe 10 years ago at this point, and I think since then, it's clear to me that although there might not be so much in the published literature, of course that's improving, there is actually a lot already out there, but I have not really seen an aggregation of that work yet. And so we're hoping to do that this year. The second is commissioning what I'm calling kind of a best available evidence product. And we see that as something driven by demand from our missions or from our implementing partners. Is there a question that we need to answer in order to inform a decision? Let's see if we can spend a little bit of time pulling together a quick brief on that question. And then the third is a literature review that Kayleen is actually leading along with some of her colleagues on the intersection of gender and social and emotional learning. So those are kind of our technical guidance and our evidence products. And then I want to just end with how we plan to continue to engage with you. So the first is the Global Education Conference. This is in April of 2020. It will be the first time in probably 6 or 7 years that we've had the chance to bring together all USAID education staff to DC. We have public days the first 2 days, followed by a couple of internal days, and then room for consultation. So I really encourage you, social and emotional learning, soft skills development, positive youth development will be a focus track. So I really encourage you to attend if you're based in DC or if you'll be around. The second thing that I want to highlight is actually the social and emotional learning and soft skills page on EduLinks. So EduLinks is the place on the internet where USAID's Office of Education kind of houses all of our authoritative content. And the thing that I want to call your attention to is this call to action at the bottom. So we're going to continue to update content on this website throughout the year, but we really are asking for you, let us know, please sign up for a listserv, because if you are programming, if you are researching, if you are thinking about policy, if you are a critic of this work, we do want to hear from you. Even though many of our other opportunities to engage with partners through ECCN will come to a close, we don't see that as the close of our engagement with you. So I think that essentially will feed the SEL Champions listserv. So for example, the indicator guidance, the guidance that comes out of this workshop next week, we're hoping to be able to send out for technical vetting. Please do let us know if you would like to be a part of that. And then finally, I wanted to just highlight that we program social and emotional skills work in education and beyond through a wide variety of different mechanisms, both mission-based, but also DC-based. And they're not just in the Office of Education. So the DIV APS and LASER are two funds that are actually in the Global Development Lab. And both of them have had calls for SEL-specific work over the past few months. And then lastly, I do want to put in a plug. So for my Youth Power colleagues, there's Youth Power Learn, and that's kicking off later this week. And that is the research and practice focused arm of that work. And it's a really robust community of practice. They actually have convened kind of a measurement technical group that's really meant to invite people to discuss what's on the cutting edge, what are the intractable problems, and I think they're doing a huge service to the community. So with that, I will close and hand it over to my colleague, Ramya.
Let me remind our speakers to get really, really friendly with that mic. Yes.
Is this friendly enough? Okay, great. So good afternoon. My name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I'm a senior education specialist and thematic lead for learning assessment systems at the GPE Secretariat. So GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, hasn't really had, in terms of its secretariat, an explicit engagement with the area of social emotional learning. But we've been increasingly aware of the fact that it's, a big priority for our partner countries. And so we've recently undertaken a piece of work, which we're calling a landscape review, looking at what we have used the term 21st century skills. And I'll show you our definition of how we define that. But we're talking, I think, essentially about the same broad area as social emotional learning, trying to understand whether there's a potential role for the global partnership in this space and what that role could be. So most of this presentation is essentially going to give a preview of this landscape review report that will be published on our website in January. But first, just there's limited time, but just very quick background on GPE in case any of you are not familiar. We're a partnership that really focuses on strengthening of education systems. So we work with our partner countries, particularly around the development of their education sector plans, and then the implementation of those sector plans. And bringing in the multitude of partners that exist at both country and global levels to get behind that sector plan and to support the government in their policy aspirations. GPE, here in Washington, D.C., we have our secretariat, which is relatively small, but we are in fact a partnership, and that means that we have these different constituencies that make up what we commonly refer to as GPE. So that includes our partner countries, and I'll show you a map of where these countries are, but also donors, international organizations such as the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, etc., private sector, civil society, and teachers' organizations. So most of this presentation is talking about our GPE Secretariat, but GPE, it's important to keep in mind, is this broader partnership, this broader collective of actors. So as of this year, we now have 68 partner countries, primarily low-income and lower middle-income countries, the majority of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, but then we also have a number in Asia and some other parts of the world as well. And you can see that from the time that we were established in 2002 as the Fast Track Initiative, the EFA Fast Track Initiative, up to now, there's been a big growth, and we can continue to see, I think, that growth. So broadly speaking, just to situate this landscape review, we have a global initiative called Assessment for Learning, or A4L. And this is a global initiative that is working to strengthen national learning assessment systems. Because as you may be aware, in GPE's funding model, we actually have a requirement that says that in order for a country to receive implementation grant funding from the GPE, there has to be a system or a mechanism in place for the country to monitor learning outcomes. Or if that's not there, they're supposed to use a portion of the GPE funding to develop such a system. So this is a pretty big lever, and so we're supporting work around learning assessment in different forms in different countries. But we have this complementary initiative to reinforce some of that work at the country level. And so there's one piece of it, I won't go into detail, but there's one piece of it that's working to support countries to analyze or to diagnose their national learning assessment system. We're also providing support to 2 UNESCO regional offices that run regional networks on learning assessment. And then finally, we've been undertaking this work on 21st century skills, which even though here it says measurement, in fact, this landscape review is not focusing solely on measurement, but rather much more broadly trying to understand what, if anything, GPE should be doing more of in this space. So this landscape review, so as I said, we have an emphasis on learning assessment systems, much like I'm sure all of your organizations, improving learning outcomes as a whole is really a key goal for us in our current strategic plan, which is called GPE 2020. And to measure that, we look generally at whether countries are making improvements in learning outcomes. We don't specifically say that it only has to be in terms of literacy and numeracy, but of course, by default, this is generally the kinds of data that we find that are comparable over time. But we do recognize that 21st century skills or social emotional learning is increasingly important. So the goal of this review was to really consider the role that GPE could consider taking to support our partner countries in embedding these skills within their education systems. So there's 4 components to the review. One, a literature review, a review of some of the different frameworks and initiatives that are out there. Secondly, looking specifically at 15 of our countries, partner countries, looking at their education sector plans and their GPE grant documents in order to understand, even at the level of policy and planning, what are they saying about these skills, and are we, GPE, actually funding them to implement any of those areas. Then we did some work with the Brookings Institution with Dr. Esther Kerr and her team, looking specifically at assessments of 21st century skills in these same 15, because as consisting of a number of different organizations. So we looked also at the efforts, relevant initiatives by these partners. So the overall definition, and again, so we've used the terminology of 21st century skills because it was sort of a legacy from the beginnings of this particular A4L initiative. We're not necessarily tied to this terminology, and I think we've heard a lot that there's a lot of sort of malleability between the different terms. But we're essentially using a definition that's adapted from Binkley and colleagues, and essentially saying that these are ways of thinking, learning, and working in the world. And giving some examples here: creativity and innovation, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, etc. It's purposely a very sort of wide open definition because as this is sort of an initial inquiry for us into this space, we wanted to kind of leave it pretty open in terms of being able to see which references to any of these skills feature in country sector plans and GPE funding. So in terms of the literature review piece, we essentially looked at a few different things here. We started really by even, considering the fact that SDG 4, we have at least 2 targets that make reference to, broad areas of 21st century skills, including target 4.4, which looks at TVET, youth and work skills, but also, of course, SDG 4.7. We looked at a range of different definitions and frameworks that have been created over the last years. As colleagues have said, a number of these sort of come more from the developed world, but nonetheless have found currency also in some of the countries that we work with. So ATC 21S, the Framework for 21st Century Learning, for example, work from UNESCO Bangkok on transversal competencies, the UNICEF Life Skills and Citizenship Education Initiative in the Middle East and North Africa. And we found that, there's some unique features to each of these, but, a lot of overlap as well. And most of them reference the skills that are referred to in the definition that we're using for our review. We also looked a bit deeper into some of the initiatives in recent years, such as the Learning Metrics Task Force, the work that Brookings has been doing on skills for a changing world. We found that the CASEL and the UNICEF MENA framework in particular were quite interesting because they have sort of the beginnings of a notion of a systems approach laid out in their respective frameworks. And from GPU's perspective, and what we eventually found with this review, is that a lot of the work that's been undertaken tends to emphasize one aspect of the education system or other, but it's really hard to find examples where you have kind of a whole systems orientation. So that was quite interesting. We also looked kind of briefly at some of the different cross-national assessments that we have that touch on aspects of 21st century skills. PISA, for example, with the optional domains, the results were published just last week, and PISA 2018 included global competence, of course. We have the ICCS and the ICILS from the IEA, the Southeast Asia Learning Primary Learning Metric, the Latin American Regional Assessment that includes a module on social-emotional learning in this year's round. So, this is also something that we're seeing in cross-national assessments as a feature. So then, in terms of the stock take, so as I said, we focused essentially on 15 countries, and the goal here was to look at these countries' policy orientations in terms of their education sector plans, and then look at what, if anything, we GPE have supported through our funding to support those aspirations. So we looked at the latest, what we call the SPIG, or the Education Sector Program Implementation Grants, which is the large grant that we offer to countries to implement their sector plans. The latest grant documents available from the beginning of this year, and then the sector plans on which those are based. And essentially 15 countries, and the country selection was essentially, we looked at the same countries that had self-selected into the work that Brookings was undertaking at the same time, looking specifically on measurement. So the countries are listed here, essentially all in Africa and Asia, because that's the focus of this Assessment for Learning initiative. And we looked generally at how many education sector plans actually reference these skills, which of the skills, if any, sort of come up more prominently, and then of course how many of the grants include activities related to these skills. Are there any observable patterns in terms of which parts of sector plans tend to feature these? Same thing for the grants. Are there particular types of activities, curriculum development, teaching, assessment, et cetera, where we find that these are operationalized? So generally speaking, just in terms of the types of skills, so when you look across education sector plans and the SPIGs, we found a lot of reference particularly to ICT literacy or IT literacy, as well as to creativity and innovation and critical thinking, problem solving, kind of in that order. But generally speaking, and I'll show this in the next slide as well, all of the sector plans have a strong sort of openness and desire to move education systems to embrace this broad suite of skills. But what's critical, I think, is to note that, I don't know if you can see in the colors, but the darker blue is in terms of the education sector plans and the extent to which different types of 21st century skills are featured in the sector plans. And then the lighter blue is in terms of what, if any, types of skills are actually featured in some of the interventions that we're supporting. And there's a kind of big disconnect between the two. So essentially, the overall findings tell us that all of the countries that we looked at feature these skills, particularly in the vision and mission statements of their sector plans, but also in their policy priorities. But there were only 3 out of the 15 countries that actually included funding through the GPE SPIG to operationalize some of these aspirations. Now that doesn't mean, and this is an important caveat, that doesn't mean that the government itself may be not funding these activities or that other GPE partners are, because the SPIG is just a small fraction potentially of the different funding sources that a country has. But we generally found that countries seem to have sort of a lack of orientation in terms of how they could bring this in from a whole system perspective. To the extent that we did see support, it was more around teacher training and pedagogy. So generally speaking, a big disconnect between sort of vision and mission and aspiration and what countries applied, in any case, GPE funding towards. Then I think time is running out, but just to give a little bit about the mini studies that Brookings did. So they essentially looked at these same 15 countries and looked at whether there are assessment tools in the countries, either for national assessment or classroom assessment, that capture some of these skills or that have the potential to capture some of these skills. So they worked with the UNESCO Bangkok and Dakar offices to do this. And sorry that I'm flying through, but essentially the findings told us that the majority of the tools that were sampled in both regions were not designed to capture these skills, but potentially with a bit of tweaking could do so, depending on the subject area. So this was found to be promising on the part of the country researchers. And the study for Asia has been published by UNESCO Bangkok, and the study from Africa is coming out early next year. And then finally, the last part of the review looked at our relevant efforts from different GPE partners. So we talked to a number of our partners and found that there's been a lot, 1 minute ago, there's been a lot of work that's been undertaken, particularly around conceptualization, framing, development of curricula and materials, teacher training, measurement initiatives, et cetera. Some of the examples are here. But what we found to be kind of missing in this whole ecosystem is work that really comes from a system orientation, like I said, that tries to tie the different pieces together. And still a lot of need in terms of contextualizing what has been developed to the context of low-income countries. and research and capacity building around that. So those are essentially the findings. There's been a lot of rich history of framing, that our partner countries want to implement these skills, but have not used our funding for that purpose, that assessment tools have the potential to capture the skills, and finally, that there's been a lot of work undertaken in the partnership, but a lot of gaps, particularly from a system-wide lens. And then, so overall, in terms of the recommendations and where we go from here, last slide, I promise. So as I said, we're publishing this report in January on our website. And we feel that, we hope that simply publishing the report will hopefully send a signal that GPE is increasingly open to supporting more work in this area, that if a country has this in its sector plan, that there should not be any resistance to applying for GPE funding for the purposes of actually implementing some of those policy priorities. We would like to participate more in global policy dialogue and advocacy around 21st century skills. So we welcome, any ideas that you have in that regard. We have now a new initiative that we've just launched called the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange that we think provides promise in terms of being able to potentially support research and advocacy, particularly at global and regional levels around the area of 21st century skills. So we're potentially excited. Our board is meeting this week. We're in the process of developing our next strategy, which hopefully will give a nod to this notion that we have a broad range of skills that are important to countries. So we'll stay tuned on that. But in any case, we welcome opportunities to partner and to further the conversation. Thank you. Sorry if I took.
Isn't it wonderful how much is going on compared to when I first started in 2017 with ECCN, and we set up a team to do SEL and to try to have some highlight what was being done and what could be done. I think it's really marvelous that we can barely fit this into the allotted time. I'm going to ask our panelists to come up and take a seat. We'll have about 10-15 minutes of questions or comments now from the audience. And we also will be able to take some from the from online if Lauren is monitoring those back there in a moment. Yes. Do you have any from online yet, Lauren?
Yes, we have one from online.
Okay, let me take the ones in the room first, and then I'll get to that one if that's okay. So let me take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll refer them up to our group here. And we'll start with Louise Crouch over there.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity and thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. In the case of the bank, it's clear that there's a sort of age focus on kind of adolescents, young adults. And I was wondering what, and in the case of USAID and GPE, I suspect that by design, there's no targeting by age, but I was wondering whether by natural evolution or by just from the demand side of what the missions want to do and what the countries want to do, whether in either of the 2 cases, there is any kind of age clustering or clustering toward particular age groups. And I guess in the case of the bank, was that by design or was that by evolution that you ended up focusing on kind of youth and young adults?
Okay. Matthew, you had a question up here?
Unless no one else has.
Go ahead and do that one, and then we'll catch up.
I had a question for Victoria, if I may. I read this study about the Big Five on the way over here, actually, and it's great that you presented it. In general, I have this concern that people try and adapt SEL measurements in quite a superficial way. And so I'm interested that the conclusions of this study are mainly around methodology. And there wasn't a mention, at least in what you presented, in questioning the model itself, whether the Big Five model is applicable in these contexts. I wonder if you could just comment on that briefly.
Okay, and let me see. Yes, someone from school to school. Your name is?
So question for USAID. There was, I think in your 2020 strategy looking at gender and SEL, but what about students with learning disabilities, especially emotional disabilities like ODD, operational defiance disorder? How do those tie into SEL and integrating that with students with disabilities?
Great. So let's Let me start perhaps with, since Victoria started out with her talk, let's let her get a first stab at a couple of these questions and then pass it down.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you for the great question. I think this was just natural evolution. The people who are close to adolescence are closer to the labor market. So those are the people who we think we really need to get up in shape so they can join the workforce and become productive. Now, from the theoretical point of view, of course, socio-emotional skills are built throughout the life cycle. And there was, I didn't present it, but there was a paper that was created in collaboration between World Bank and academic psychologists, which presented a model called the practice model, which tried to build a progression of skills throughout the life cycle, starting from the early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and so on. The great thing, of course, the great thing I think about socio-emotional skills is that they're malleable and they stay malleable as opposed to foundational cognitive skills. Socio-emotional skills stay malleable throughout life. That's why we can engage in these types of interventions. But I think in terms of if we put a distribution of all the interventions, it's probably right that most of them would be sort of late secondary and then out of school and through youth employment programs. But there are definitely examples, and we're currently engaged in a big work program on the early childhood development and making sure that they get the stimulation needed in order to build those foundational socio-emotional skills as well. I just did not present it there. Should I take all the questions to me? Or?
Let's do that one on down, and then we'll come back to the other one. Yes. Ramya.
Yeah. So yes, to Luis's question. So as you know, of course, GPE focuses on, at least currently focus on basic education, primary and lower and secondary. We support a range of work around early childhood as well. But we saw that in terms of the 15 countries whose sector plans we looked at, a lot of the discourse around these skills was framed very much in terms of youth employability and entry into the job markets and making sure that, you know, education systems prepare them for that. So from the demand side, that seems to be a predominant sort of orientation. But in the report, we're being careful to say that, you know, as Victoria said, the development of these skills is lifelong. There's you know, a lot of it that happens in early childhood and continues, you know, primary, secondary, and beyond. But from a demand side, it does seem that it's coming more from the youth and skills perspective, I would say, in what we've seen.
Yeah, and I think from us, it'll depend a lot. So obviously each of our missions has been engaging in the higher ed space, the youth workforce space, and then primary education in some cases for 20 years, 30 years. So I think the inclusion of social and emotional skills or soft skills is going to be layered on top of that history. So I think it'll vary a lot country by country. I do think, you know, a lot of our youth workforce work shares a lot of the outcomes that Victoria and Ramya just talked about. And I think you'll see that in a lot of the positive youth development work that we do, and that'll stretch far beyond just basic education. But in our policy, we do emphasize pre-primary all the way through higher ed. And something that I think the SEL working group will try and support missions to do is think about what are the ways in which these skills manifest themselves at different ages and stages, and then is the manifestation of those skills or the achievement of those skills the goal, or is it linked to some other goal, whether that is broader stability, countering violent extremism, whether that's educational outcomes, whatever kind of the bigger picture might be.
I think that Matthew's question was probably directed to Victoria.
Sure, although Victoria does not feel like she's very qualified to answer, because that's a very, thank you for the question, it's a very technical question that is more directed to the psychologists who study those models. Now, having worked with those psychologists, the way that I interpret what they're saying is that even though we can focus on the skills and the behaviors and how they get expressed, the underlying all of that apparently could still be mapped onto the big 5 personality traits. So I don't know if that underlying model is indeed valid for the developing country context, but actually I just looked again at the abstract for that science study. It seems that when they went to the internet samples, which are more educated people in the same countries, they were able to get validity even on that even on that questionnaire, which again, could be that again, the underlying structure is valid. It's just that it is hard to implement it in the developing country context, but I am no expert in that question.
Thank you. And we have the school-to-school question.
Yes, and that's a great question. So I will say,
Repeat it for the audience.
oh yes, so the question was about how are students with disability included in kind of our vision for our technical priorities this year, and then particularly thinking about students with emotional disabilities, so operational defiance disorder. So I will say I am not a child psychologist, so I definitely cannot pretend to speak to the specifics of ODD, for example. But what I will say is that, so in terms of what our technical priorities are for this year, we do have two colleagues that we work closely with, Leah Maxon and Josh Josa, who are our disability inclusion specialists, who are part of the SEL working group. And our assessment, and having done the policy brief, is that we need probably a little more time to think about what is USAID's value add in terms of issuing what types of guidance around disability inclusion. So for example, other priorities that USAID is working on this year are are how to identify students with disabilities at younger ages, for example, that spans the range of disabilities. And so I think, and Ben and Elena, correct me, you know, or add to this if you have other observations, but I think what we're hoping to do is not tackle disability inclusion in isolation through SEL, but writ large, be much better as the Office of Education in giving guidance about disability inclusion. So I don't know if that helps address it a little.
Great. Other questions or comments? On that last one, I just want to add one thing in, Julie, with the on the crisis and conflict, and particularly the low-income settings, where there have been studies, there has been a very high level of both learning and physical disabilities appearing in low-income countries in post-conflict and conflict settings. And so it isn't a marginalized thing. It isn't like a small minority that needs to be taken care of. It's a very large problem. And I think that that's something that we hope that it's worth giving more attention to. Anybody else?
We do have a couple online.
Okay, let's take the online questions.
So the first online question, I think, came after Victoria's presentation from Idalia Rodriguez Morales. I wonder if the triangulation of skills is intended to create a single measure of skill, or just to have a fuller picture of a single student's skill. If the purpose is for the former, I would worry about the score's intrinsic bias and standards. For example, teachers assessing differently boys and girls in terms of their math interest or grit.
Is there another question?
And there's a couple other questions. One from Shelby French. Did any of the reviews and research done by the panelist organizations highlight SEL outcomes related to reduction in violence, whether in schools or communities overall? Shelby is with Child Fund, and they have a program model called School-Based Violence Prevention that uses SEL in its design. And then a couple, I think, clarification questions for USAID about if there is a way to sign up for the SEL Champions Listserv, or if they should contact you directly, Anjuli, to sign up for that. And then also if you could share again the information about the upcoming event in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so the first question again was?
If the triangulation of skills is intended to create a single measure of skill, or just to have a fuller picture of a single student's skills. They were worried about assessor bias.
Sure, and that's a very valid factor to worry about. Thank you for that question. I think at this point in our work program, what we're trying to do is to see how different teacher reports would be from self-reports, and how different they would be from even direct observer reports, and whether we can then look at these differences and try to think about them in a systematic way. I don't think we're currently thinking of getting to a single score, definitely not a single score on different skills. We're not trying to get into one social-emotional skills score, if that's what was meant. But yes, we're definitely keeping in mind that teacher reports are also not free of bias. So nothing is free of bias. We're just trying to see if we can get to something by looking at different reports and trying to find the truth somewhere.
I think the one from Child Fund and the last two are probably one that you might be able to answer, Anjuli.
Yeah, and I think the first question Shelby had was right, SEL as something that can reduce violence at different levels. So USAID does have quite a few programs that are funded currently to do exactly that. So there's the Lara project in Uganda, and then there's programming in Honduras and Guatemala. Where we're at right now is that essentially that's why one of our technical priorities is to try and do a systematic review to understand how social and emotional skills or soft skills might be either mediating, moderating, causing reductions in violence at various levels. So that's definitely of interest to us. And I think there are a lot of robust program models out there that we can look to. And then in terms of how to sign up for the SEL listserv, I can drop it in the chat or however you guys want to do it. But essentially you can either go to EduLinks and sign up there, you can email me, and the Global Education Conference also has its own EduLinks page. So we'll make sure to put that in the chat so folks can take a look at that.
Okay, well, let's have another hand for this wonderful panel.